Hello, I'm Bill Jenkins, and this is another addendum to the Avengers podcast. The 1970s, that is the subject of today's podcast. Well, in America, most people would talk about the 1970s as being a decade from 1970 to December 31st of 1979. That's because in America, everything is counted from the 0 year to the 9 year. Now, in actual mathematics, it would be counted from 1 to 10. Which means the 70s would have lasted from January 1st of 1971 to December 31st of 1980. Now, I can properly tell you I was born in 1976 and I have a photographic memory, which is one of those people who can remember almost everything. The actress Mary Lou Henner claims to be able to remember herself as literally like a 1-month-old baby back. Don't ask me how she does that, but that's what she claimed. Well, all I know is this. I remember the end of the 70s pretty well. And I've read a lot of books and everything and have a lot of things from scrapbooks and stuff. And so I can pretty well tell you that the era we call the 70s really was not a decade. It was really about 7 years, okay? It was really about 1973 to 1980. And the 80s truly began when Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. And so really what you have to understand is before the 70s, we had very long eras. And now an era is different than a decade because an era can go for a much longer period than a decade. Now, the 1950s truly began in 1948. That was the year Harry Truman was running for his election. As remember, Harry Truman became president because FDR died. And this was basically the year of the Berlin airlift. 1948 was the beginning of the Cold War. It was also the beginning of most of the television shows. In 1948, two very famous television shows debuted that year. And by 1950, every major city in the United States would have a television channel. Some had a full 3 television channels, usually ABC, NBC, CBS, and some actually had a Dumont television network too. Dumont basically ended, I think, in the mid-50s. But I'm trying to look here and remember. 1948 was the year that Candid Microphone debuted on ABC, and it was renamed Candid Camera in 1949. It was also the year the Texaco Star Theater, hosted by Milton Berle, debuted on NBC, and that would be broadcast until 1956. So basically, 1948 is the beginning of everything. It's the beginning of the Cold War. It's the beginning of modern television. Pretty much everything begins in 1948. 1948 was also the year that the major automakers began releasing their first post-war cars. The most famous being the post-war Fords and Mercurys. The 1949 Mercury and the 1949 Ford, those were basically big-time cars with customizers and hot rodders. So 1948 was also the first year that Cadillac and Oldsmobile debuted overhead valve V8 motors. And so the 1949 Olds Rocket 88, the 1949 Cadillac, those cars were immediately loved by hot rodders, and hot rodders would do anything to find a junked Cadillac or a junked Oldsmobile in the junkyard just to pluck out the motor so they could put it in their Ford Roadster and run around with it. But still, basically then, the flathead Ford was still number one, but the overhead valve motors were coming in. And also that year, the first brand new Chevrolets. It was a real big year, 1948 was, because that's when everything that we know began to debut. But when did this era, this post-war / 50s era end? Well, there's some debate on that. I think the best date to really choose when that ended would have been January 1st of 1963. 1963 was the real birth of what we call the Kennedy era. From 1963 until the death of Teddy Kennedy, there would be a Kennedy in the government from then on. And in 1963, when that began, you would end up having Teddy Kennedy in the Senate, you would have Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General, and you'd have JFK running the White House. By that point, by 63, John F. Kennedy was really the president. He had gotten past the Cuban Missile Crisis and Bay of Pigs and all of that and was clearly in control. And that was when he was beginning to shape a, quote, agenda for the future. But 63 was really the first real year that the blacks really started to riot in America. Race riots broke out everywhere in America in 63, from places like Birmingham, Alabama to Cambridge, Maryland, and of course you later would have the March on Washington. And so 63 was kind of the beginning of the 60s, but it was the beginning of the 60s without hippie freaks, okay? Then when JFK is killed, that's when it goes into high gear. And basically from November 22nd of 1963 all the way until Richard Nixon pulls the troops out of Vietnam in January of 1973, basically you had one huge long era there, which was a long nightmare for a lot of people, where everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong. And the degeneracy just continued to spiral year after year after year. And so, what was the 70s? Basically, the 70s was like the big letdown from the 60s. It was kind of like, it's like that day after you got drunk or high the night before, when you felt so good the night before, and you wake up the next morning with that big throbbing headache, and you find out that you trashed your apartment, and everything's just trashed, and you're like, oh, I got to clean all this mess up. That was the 70s, you know. It was a letdown. 1973, late 72 was when the first automobile emissions became mandatory all over the country, and you started to have these new, bigger, longer cars with rollover protection and all of them in there, and hard tops began to disappear. You had these much smaller motors debut in cars, and the cars became very big and very, they weren't sporty anymore. They began putting these heavy bumpers on the front of cars in 1971, and so by 73, basically, cars were just becoming behemoths. And then you had the, later on, late 73, you had the gas shortage, and basically that's what it was. It was a mess. Everything that could go wrong in 73 went wrong. And but it was not like the 60s. In the 60s, it was turmoil. You know, in the 70s, it was just like, well, this is all there is. You know, it's kind of like at the end of Easy Rider, when Wyatt looks at Billy and he says, we blew it. And basically, that's the kind of thing. That was basically the 70s. It was kind of like this idea of, we blew it. And that could be the general saying for the entire period from 73 to 80. If you remember the movie Dazed and Confused, there's a part in the movie where the young blonde teacher, I believe, in the one class in the school, is talking about the 68 convention. Now, Dazed and Confused is taking place in the last day of school, 1976. And she's talking about the 68 convention, which at that period had only been, let me do the math on it here, 8 years before. It says she's talking about her time, and already by then the kids are looking at it like, wah, 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 wah. You know, the kids aren't even listening to her. Because, like I said, the 70s were the era where everything that seemed to be cool was past. It was also the era where things like cable television and all the stuff that you see today, the full spectrum dominance of all sports would come to be, and basically a lot of this escapism that you see in our culture now, this, how do I say it, basically the kidification of adulthood came out in the 70s. And it was a slow process where suddenly, you know, if you look pictures from the 60s, you won't see a lot of adults wearing football clothing and stuff. And you go out now to the store and you'll see 60-year-old men, you know, all decked out in football memorabilia. So, I mean, it's a different era. But, yeah, the 70s was kind of the birth of that. It was also the birth of when you realized that your cities had all turned to crap after the riots of the 60s. And you looked around and realized that nobody was coming to rebuild this. It was just going to get worse. And it was also the time where I think that people began to finally question adults. Because it used to be before that time, you always kind of believed that adults knew what they were doing. And all of a sudden, here comes the 70s, and it looked like no adult knew what they were doing. Well, then that was different than the 80s when Ronald Reagan took over, because Ronald Reagan made it appear like an adult was in charge. But that didn't last very long, because obviously by the time Bill Clinton would take over, that was gone. But back to the 70s, things I can remember about the 70s was this. One of the things that I remember about the 70s was you didn't have to have a lot of money to have good-looking clothes. Back then in the summertime, your clothes were basically tank tops or shirts, you know, You could have either regular sleeve shirts or cut sleeve shirts. But usually tank tops were the big things, and especially the tank tops with iron-ons on the front of them, usually with cars on the front of them, or like a Budweiser, a Chevrolet, or whatever like that. Tank tops were big in the 70s. And in the 70s, people did buy shorts, like gym shorts or running shorts. Basically, if you were like in school, you had one, or you might have a pair of shorts for basically like if you're going to a cookout or something like that, a pair of nice shorts. But most of the time, if you were a kid or you were at your house, most of the time if you wore shorts, you wore basically an old pair of ratty jeans that were cut off and made into cutoffs. And the cutoffs were never hemmed. They always had a lot of fringe on the bottom of them. And ever so often you'd have to go over the fringe and cut off the little white strings that came out of it. But that was what we all did. And a lot of people just wore cutoffs like that. You could see pictures from the 70s of kids at the beach, and they were wearing shaggy cutoffs. That was kind of the thing. You didn't have to have a lot of money. And most of the clothes were fairly cheap. I mean, you could dress in the newest styles from basically places like Kmart. There wasn't this idea. It was coming out of the hippie era where the hippies kind of did not value clothes that much. And there was this idea of basically just do what you want, man. Let it all hang out. Now, during the disco era, it became more about expensive clothes and stuff like that. But you could see the average person living their average life in the 70s. Their clothes looked, by today's standards, their clothes looked pretty cheap. And that was a wonderful thing about that era, because there wasn't a whole lot of this obsession about image like there is now. Everything today becomes about image. And then you could have fun and basically cheap clothes and basically some Converse shoes or Keds. Or if you were styling a little bit, you might have some of those newfangled Nike shoes or Pumas or something like that. But basically cheap shoes, cut-off jeans, and a cheap T-shirt. And for everyday wear, basically you had your blue jeans, and maybe like in the winter you might have like a flannel or a sub-shirt like that, and then in the summer you'd have T-shirts. A lot of T-shirts with a lot of things on them, and different things like that. A lot of kids wore baseball shirts and stuff like that. It was just a time in which you could be cool like that. I mean, a lot of people wore sandals. It was a time in which there was not this huge emphasis on image. It was also a time at which people were somewhat a little more chill about how they did things. This whole idea of the social justice and stuff like that in the 70s was pretty much poo-pooed on. It was because in the 60s, people were just confronted with the social justice stuff. In fact, people sometimes mix up hippies and SJWs. Well, the SJWs, some SJWs were hippies, but not all hippies were SJWs. A lot of hippies didn't want anything to do with the SJWs. They might have had liberal beliefs, but a lot of the hippies got so sick of the politics that they abandoned the cities and went in to live on these communes, where basically the idea was believe what you want, read what you want, do what you want, just be here and do what you want. In the 70s, there was still some of that going on where people were like, hey, man, whatever floats your boat, man, we don't care. And so that was kind of this general idea at that time period was be yourself, do your own thing. And so the SJW kind of thing would have been basically considered, wow, it's a bummer, man. We don't want to talk about that. And people just didn't want to hear all this crap like they want to now. That whole kind of thing back then would have been considered just weird. But you just didn't have to be confronted with all this. Back then, people just wanted to party, hang out, and have a good time. Another thing I remember about back then was you could furnish your outdoors of your house very cheaply. Back then, everybody wanted redwood outdoor furniture. You had a redwood picnic table. You oftentimes had redwood chairs on the back of your little stoop or whatever. Decks came on bigger later. Decks were more of a thing in the 80s, but usually they had like a stoop or whatever out back. Another thing that was real big was all the lawn chairs back then. All the lawn chairs in the 70s were basically those aluminum chairs, and they all had that netting stuff on them. And, you see later on the more modern lawn chairs that came out in the 80s and 90s, they all had that plastic kind of stuff. This old stuff had a kind of a cloth webbing on them in the 70s, and everybody had them, and they were always in different kind of tacky colors. You'd see them in red, white, and blue, or whatever. Another thing, of course, you could not forget about that era was the bicentennial. I can still remember growing up into the late 80s, early 90s, and seeing bridges and things still painted up with their bicentennial stuff. I mean, literally, it was like the bicentennial that never ended because a lot of towns didn't paint over their bicentennial murals for 10 or 15 years after the 70s. And so as late as 1993, you were still seeing bicentennial murals in some small towns. Bicentennial everything was huge back then. I remember if you had bicentennial quarters, everybody wanted to save them, but obviously they're not worth that much now. But yeah, the bicentennial thing, that was always a big thing. Everybody wanted bicentennial stuff. But it was just different, this whole oppressive system of political correctness would have been unthinkable back then. You had at the time, you had All in the Family, Sanford and Son, the Jeffersons and stuff like that. People could pretty much say what they wanted, so long as it wasn't overly dirty. I mean, there wasn't a lot of this sex stuff in the way there is now. It was sex, but it was just done a little differently. But it was just a different world, a different worldview, a worldview that if you had to explain it to somebody living today, nobody would ever understand it. But it was just a different world. And the way I look at it now is I see the way these kids are listening to music now. And we've got songs like Wet Ass Pussy by Cardi B. Now, if I compare that to like the 1970s and having some Joe Walsh or something on there, give me the Joe Walsh any day of the week. The guy is like in his 70s now and he's still cool. And not to mention, Joe Walsh is not only still cool, he is Ringo Starr's brother-in-law, which you can't go wrong with that, can you? But yeah, the 70s was also the time in which you realized that Paul McCartney could actually be an artist in his own right. John Lennon basically retired from singing in 1975 when his son Sean was born, and he didn't come out of retirement officially again until 1980. And then right before he was murdered in front of his the Dakota apartment in 1980, he had just basically, I think a few months before, had released his double album, Double Fantasy. He had just officially came back out of retirement that year. And so basically 75, John Lennon was kind of becoming an afterthought. He wasn't even doing TV or anything at that point anymore. Paul McCartney had become an artist in his own right. Wings was one of the hugest bands on the earth. And literally, he could go anywhere and sell out stadiums. And that was kind of the thing. It was just a whole different kind of vibe. All that political crap from the 60s was kind of gone. And in many ways, we have not had a decade and a time period where we had peace from that stuff really since the 80s, really. In the 70s, they kind of got away with a lot of that SJW stuff. People are like, shut up about it. Nobody wants to hear it anymore. And during the 80s, it was all that America, dang it, love it or leave it stuff, with Reagan coming out of the urban cowboy era. And then in the 90s, from the time Bill Clinton was in office until the modern day, everything has been all politics all the time, to the point that you don't have any real escape from anything going on right now. And it's literally been, I would say, the past 27, 26 years where you cannot escape all this crap. Everything is just social justice all the time. It's gotten progressively worse, but, it just continues on and on and on, and you never get any peace from it. That's why people so much love looking back at these retro shows and all this stuff. And these are things I remember. Another thing I remember from the 70s, and a lot of people forget this, was they used to take old car rims, and they would get like a big giant rubber thing, and they would make rubber tire planters. And people would use these tire planters and put them out in front of their trailer. And they would have these rubber tire planters planted with flowers. That used to be like the de rigueur thing every house trailer liver had to have. You at least had to have one tire planter out in front of your trailer. And usually you'd have a deck or a stoop or whatever built out front, and it would always usually be redwood colored. Sometimes it wouldn't be the same color, but yeah. Basically, that was styling back then. It was cheap clothes, redwood furniture, old lawn chairs, and everybody was happy. We didn't have this whole obsession with constantly being entertained. We entertained ourselves. And today, you cannot get your child to go out of the house unless he has his phone and can play an immense amount of games on that phone. Back then, it was basically like when your parents took you to a cousin's house or something for a cookout. You were pretty much told you didn't mope around. Go play with your cousins and come back when we call you, and don't bother us. And that was kind of the way things were. And so, to a child today who has to be led by the hand to do everything, the world of 1978 or 79 would scare him to death because he wouldn't know what to do because he's too used to being led around by the hand to do everything. And that's really sad because we've lost a real part of our culture. We've lost that independence. And we've also lost a lot of that basically just being cool with people. I never heard of people when I was young actually wanting to get into fist fights because you wanted to vote for Jimmy Carter or something like that. People are like, meh, we like that guy or we like this guy. Nobody really cares. But now you see how everything has become so hyper politicized, hyper racialized, hyper, and now nobody gets peace from anything. And I think those of us who remember enough of that era beforehand, we have trouble in today's world because we just do not understand this hyper politicization and why everybody just can't sit back and have a good time. I often ask myself that, and the answer I always get is, I don't know. But that's about all I have to say about that. I'm Bill Jenkins. This has been another edition of the Avengers Podcast. Have a good day.